Hello.
Am I audible and visible, Mukesh, now?
Audible, yes. Visible, you need to.
Rotate yourself.
Yeah, just a sec. Bansal is there.
Push
हाँ
your
हो गया
device there, Ramesh. Yeah.
हाँ हो गया ठीक है चालू हो रहे हैं फिर
I can see myself, but I'm not sure others are able to see
शुरू
me.
कर रहे हैं फिर हाँ शुरू कर रहे हैं 1 मिनट में शुरू कर
Yeah.
ठीक है
Ramesh, you're rotated 90 degrees somehow.
वो
You
देख
need to
लेते हैं
change your
ठीक है कर लिया
device angle.
Yeah. That's
Yeah, that works.
हाँ मैंने उसे कर लिया था वो ठीक कर लिया था
Okay, good.
कर लेते हैं ओके Yeah, hi Ramesh. Now you
Hi.
are great, looking great and straight. So I think this is 3:50 and we should go live now. Unfortunately, we did not get time to discuss. So let's go live.
Okay.
So welcome all the alumni, attendees, their families, their friends, and thank you Alumni Association for providing this opportunity for the panel discussion today titled Future of R&D. Thank you the panelists for taking time in various geographies. So the format we are going to follow is, would request each one of you to give 1 minute introduction, and then we would have specific topics, queries, issues, which would be directed at a specific panelist. That would be the first round, and then we would move to the next round, which will be a discussion mode. So I would start with Sandeep, and I will be the last, being the moderator. In the 1 minute discussion, we would start with Sandeep, and then we move to Sid, and then Pradeep, followed by Ramesh and Anubhav. And in the end, I would give my 1 minute introduction. So over to you, Sandeep.
Thanks, Mukesh. Quite an interesting topic. And also my perspective is shaped by my own journey. So, after graduating from IIT in '86, I did my master's and PhD at LSU in a program that allowed me to do research as a visiting scientist, first at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland on remote sensing from Earth orbiting satellites. Then I went to Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee, worked on robotics. And from there, I moved to NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California, which is a sponsor for all the space missions to other planets. So I started there in the neural networks and the machine learning group. In fact, many of the algorithms that are now driving machine learning as we see today, infusing in every aspect of our digital life, were invented by my colleagues in the group when I started off. Okay. So I was there for about 12 years, and then I ran Ultra Computing Technologies. It was the largest computational sciences group in NASA, and half of the group was focused on fundamental advances in space computing that will be relevant 20, 30 years in future. DNA computing, reconfigured computing, I incubated quantum computing. Now we are starting to see the first sets of hardware from a chip that was originally developed in the group. And then other half of was very applied research solving targeted problems of national relevance in intelligence analysis, remote sensing, subsurface imaging, using radar, rockets, reusable launch vehicle, spacecraft health management, etc. Basically all high risk, hard science, which again depended on national lab, industry, and government partnerships. So after that, I left to go do technology startups and have founded a number of companies in fintech, digital electronic exchanges, genomic, proteomic, biochips, security, sensors, IoT, then oil and gas, then medical devices. But the underlying lens has always been ultra weak signal processing and high interference. And today I work on companies incubated around my inventions. So specifically change gears. And now at Biology, I'm building nanoscale biosensors for basically tracking, detecting aerosolized coronavirus, in crowded indoor spaces. It's like seeing the invisible enemy is an interesting problem. And I know that COVID will be over, but the risk of future waves will persist, and we just can't shut down economies again. And just on the other extreme is a company, Toroid, working on blockchain platforms and high density IoT, which is very different from trading Bitcoin. So that's sort of a quick perspective.
Great. So
Things are done.
very satisfying journey, I must say. Would love to hear more about the stuff subsequently. So Pradeep, over to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Mukesh. So I graduated from chemical engineering in 1987, but I never really worked in an engineering area. At the same time, I was never far away from technology and data in my career. So after working in few marketing companies, I joined Citibank, and I have been with banking for almost 22 years now. My special interest has been in digital banking and fintech. Last 12 years, I have been involved with fair amount of startups as well as fintech companies. So my interest remains on one hand, how organizations work, and on the other hand, how organizations use technology as well as data sciences. I think data is really important for what is happening right now. That's really my brief introduction,
Okay,
Mukesh.
great. Thank you, Pradeep. Now we move to Sid, who has some of the most relevant extracts in his profile and most relevant topics apart from Sandeep and Sid. And of course, Anubhav, all of them, Ramesh also has been operating at a global level in pure R&D. So let's hear from Sid, your journey.
Right. So thank you, Mukesh. So I'm an 85 graduate from Delhi Chemical Engineering. And I did a master's in the US, followed by PhD in Sweden. And then I came to Cambridge in the UK for a postdoc. The two postdocs spaced a few years apart. So my specialization has really been in the sort of the life sciences area. I've worked with process development, bioprocess development for large molecule purification, really looking at new technologies, technology development for optimizing those downstream processing in biologic production, pharmaceutical production, so on. I had an early career in academia in the UK, working with bioengineering companies, developing these and implementing these sort of technologies, new technologies for protein DNA purification. But I left academia relatively early, as I was always restless, and I still am, and it kind of explains my seemingly random sort of random profile at some level. So I first joined the technology consulting for a few years and worked with pharma, biotechs, looking at their portfolio optimization, new product introductions, and market strategies, etc. But then I came back to Cambridge and I was the program director for two of Cambridge University's international programs. One was the Cambridge MIT Institute, and the second was the Cambridge India Partnership. And essentially in both of these, I oversaw the academic industry partnerships, collaborative research, looking and identifying translational opportunities into spin-out companies, intellectual property management, and so on. So this whole operations of research management is what I got involved with during those days. And then for about the last maybe 10, 15 years or so, I've been really in the startup space in medical life science technology companies in various roles, including product development, innovation management, business planning, etc. But overall in the kind of research management space and in collaborative research, partnering with academia, research institutes, other large companies as well. And for the last about 2 years now, I've been at a Cambridge spin-out, Fluidic Analytics, as the head of, first I started as product director, but I'm now heading up our intellectual property management and our intellectual property portfolio and open innovation, because that for a startup, particularly in the Cambridge ecosystem and other ecosystems as well, is quite core to how we kind of capture and realize value in the business, our intellectual property from all the technologies and essentially the knowledge that we generate. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Sid. Now we move to Ramesh.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Ramesh Khan. I I'm a bit of a dinosaur in the presence of the people who have already spoken. I am a bit an oddball in the sense that I did my master's from IIT Delhi. 1981, I passed out. I jumped straight into, although I pursued a design degree, I had this biggest desire to be a design engineer, but somehow I realized that manufacturing was more where the I guess your needs were met better in organizations through routing it through manufacturing. So I started off in the capital goods industry, Crompton Greaves. Moved to several companies like the auto companies like Eicher, and then most recently I've been with Mahindra for the last 16 odd years. First about 10 years with the Mahindra and Mahindra Systech or auto components activity, and then about 5 years with a company that has invested into this activity from Spain. I mean, a Spanish company called CIE Automotive. Now, I have been with R&D, with white goods and transmission companies and so on. Technology and development of technology has always fascinated me. And I think, I believe that management problems are most easily and most, what you call sensibly addressed if you know the hot buttons of technology. And behind technology is obviously R&D and development and how those things work. So I had joined Mahindra about 2004, which has been my last job, so to say, in the auto components domain. And I think various verticals, one might argue that auto components is just converting your part to print kind of a portfolio. But having said that, I think our mission in life was to what we called as art to part or design to delivery. So we actually worked on customer problems rather than just making parts to print. And this had obviously a huge huge influence because of the way Mahindra has grown and also the way we wanted to grow our auto component portfolio. I have had, therefore, the opportunity to develop certain transmissions, some axles. So you can say that it has been more applications and not so much core R&D. But yes, I have worked very closely with teams of R&D and so on as a beneficiary of those people, and benefited a lot from very deep and active engagement with people in the design, testing, validation, fine-tuning, and those iterative kind of work. And because that interests me a lot personally. Also, I wore two hats, basically, a business hat for a larger part and a technology and development hat alongside of that. So that's me. I'm therefore more a practitioner and a applications person of technology, but very deeply involved in what developments have happened around the course of time.
Yeah, thank you, Ramesh. Would love to listen more about your practitioner perspective and the global perspective, subsequent interaction in the next round. So now we move to Anubhav. Would like to share that he is, most of us are either BTech or MTech. He's a PhD from IIT. Anubhav, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, correct, Mukesh.
Yeah, so I'm very excited because we are part of an initiative called Sarthi,
Correct.
which is an initiative which is focused more specifically on MTech and PhD. So Anubhav, why don't you just run us through your journey in a brief 1 minute?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah.
It's always pleasure to connect back to the alma mater. Looking forward to this panel discussion, which I relate very, very well with the journey which I had, career journey which I had. So, like Mukesh ji said, after completing the MTech and PhD, I spent time in Japan and then joined Jackwell Center in India, in Bangalore, which was one of the biggest after a corporate R&D center in the US, Niskayuna. We got a lot of exposure in terms of front end of the innovation, developing platform, making sure that those platforms are well protected by the IP strategy, right? And then over the period of time, I created quite a bit of unique platform, and also making sure that when we started picking up developing new concept in India, there were quite a bit of debate what type of work we should give it in India. So it's a cost driven, like the I say low cost center versus a value driven work. So we always focus on never relate India with the cost model. Low cost is a beneficial, always beneficial from Indian point of view, but always relate with the value so that you can sustain the center for the longer period of time. Did different role, started with the scientists, moved to the technology manager, and then G Advanced Material, which was I was representing, that was sold to a private equity firm. It's called Momentive. So established the India Center for them and led the team there as a global corporate R&D director for Momentive, and experience in building the right culture which nurture the innovation and also high performing team. And that point of career, I decided that there's quite a bit of on front end of innovation. And I thought this will be important to just have an idea about the back end of the innovation, that how to commercialize and how to work very, very closer with the customers, and then join Pidilite, because no other company in India have that model to create a category which is where the customers and the influencer users are at the center. So I have been working, heading the R&D center for them in the role of R&D president, whether it's a new product development, packaging development, application science. So looking forward, that's a brief introduction, Mukesh.
Thank you, Anubhav. We will talk more about your journey, your learnings, and learnings which our panel as well as our IIT Delhi students can take, and how we go about doing the entire hand-holding process, which is very important. So now I would like Sandeep to kick off the discussion with his opening note on what is this topic of future of R&D, where if we need to invest in a good future of R&D, then we need to nurture the various components of the ecosystem. Over to you, Sandeep. You have 3 to 4
All right.
minutes.
Thanks. I think the future of R&D is whatever we make it to be. But having said that, so I had a chance to listen to many of the sessions over the last 3 days. I've heard a lot being covered, from future of work in the new normal, accelerated digitization, redrawing of the supply chains, emerging technologies, sustainability, and the other shifts. And, but as I've seen with all the other forums in the last 6 to 8 months, the thinking is very heavily modulated by the COVID experience. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting is that, having done what I have the last 30 years, I think this entire experience carries to the future of R&D in an interesting way as well. Okay. So for example, and fundamentally why I say that is because the vaccine development in a record 8 months with a 95% efficacy compared to a norm of 5 to 10 years, I think sets the R&D bar going forward. All of us, in some point in our past have heard about the Manhattan Project and building the atom bomb and, the race to the moon, but that was 50 to 60 years ago. But this time we were all there. It happened right in front of us in real time. Even though we were not directly touching it, we are all impacted by it. And we understand what has actually happened, right? And if you step back and look, with now a dozen credible candidates available and accessible globally within a few months of each other, I think it is big science or R&D done right. And that does define the future of R&D. So, so it's not about solving a unit problem here, we talk about the innovations are essential, but I think the future of R&D is really meeting the challenge of our time, whether it's healthcare, clean energy, environment, agro, privacy, the big problems, so it's not to search for something abstract, what I call unobtainium. It is solving the problems in a meaningful, all of these are borderless problems now. We've arrived. And so having said, the R&D component is partly what also, Pradeep touched and so did, I think, Anubhav, that is at the end of the day, it's got to be at least an order of magnitude better in time and cost, have a broad impact. So the value proposition really is what's changing, So if it's something incremental, but to qualify as good R&D, solve a real problem and do it, an order of magnitude better, whether it's a health impact or, clinical accuracy, that's, and then lastly, is also getting, into Ramesh's comment, getting the process right so that we have a 0 time delay. We used to be in the model of, 5 years to do research, another 10 years to do product development, then 10 years to commercialize, right? So we can wait 20 years or we can try to do it quickly. where at least you and I, within 12 months, even with all the other low risk categories, we can get the vaccine. Okay. Again, to basically, so what I see is that the R&D enablers are changing. How R&D is thought about, how it's getting done is what's really changing. The problems are as I said, the society and our defines it. So let's take a look at what the enablers are. The first particular one from my entire experience I've seen, it's about the ecosystem. The problems are complex. They just cannot be, you can invent a new material. You can do many innovations in a lab with a single person, 2 or 3 people thinking a new algorithm. You can do that, right? But in order to have a broad impact, the problems require interdisciplinary, fusion of core competencies. That means it does come down to academia, industry, government partnership really playing out, as we saw in the vaccine cases. So that's why I found Sarthi exciting, because I think the underlying thesis is right. Okay, and if you take a look at it, Apple, which is the largest company, also depends on an ecosystem to bring out a new product. As large as it is, and with the resources it has, but then it's still the suppliers that make unit improvements till we get a product that we love and we pay, what we pay for it. So getting these ecosystems to carry all the way, I think is really right. And the key is why I say ecosystem, because today, given how open science is, just choosing the right ecosystems get you to 60 to 70% of R&D. That's your ground state. Your ground state for anything you do today, if you're smart, is 60 to 70% of the solution right there for picking. So that's the key. And another is, so we can talk about future of R&D being AI, IoT, but I think as it comes to basic technology, it's the toolkit. That means we want to do a few experiments, but then we want to use software like AI, software-driven iteration approach, kind of what the drug industry perfected, right? For drug screening, you can do millions of these high throughput tests in a short period of time. It's the same model. Do a few experiments, think it right, and then let software do the magic. So it's the time compression, cost compression, all of it now comes from AI. This is in aerospace, in defense, in drugs, as we see even in crop design today. Software designs crops that are more, water, require less water, they're more heat resistant, that kind of stuff. So, and then that gets us to, in terms of the future, I think what is key is the human DNA is changing, right? We used to be in a model when you have like a professor of physics, the entire student is, they're all physics basically, which works well for component innovations, but to do broad this thing, you need groups that are interdisciplinary. So if I take a case, I want to take, in my own group's case, I ran for 12 years. And so the youngest person at the age of 16 came out of Caltech undergrad. The person who was the oldest guy was Michael Zak. He was the full professor of University of Leningrad in mechanical engineering. He and Brezhnev didn't get together, right? So he was the chairman of a department before I was born. And I had another 10 people in the middle, right? You mix the DNA, you mix different disciplines, and you can create magic. Not everything works, but that's what it takes. So being able to form the right DNA, the right relationships, the right ecosystem, that's the key in order to go solve these problems, right? So it's mixing the young with the experience and everything else that fits in between. And the other part is what is changing is the physical multiplier, right? It's no longer about, and I think it's very relevant, both are seen, in an Indian versus now in the US context where it really plays out, is it's not going to be about just people doing the stuff. We've got to have people doing pieces, and we've got to give to robots. By robots, I don't mean what we see in the movies, but basically robotic printers, robotic, subsystems that can actually do part of the experiments. And so the physical multiplier is infusing more robotic touch labor in the process. And then the other is really the glue. It used to be about forging, but now we have these nanomaterials, self-generating polymers. So the glue of how, it means that the tool set with which you work is changing. Again, it gets to the tool set. So the right ecosystem, the right tool set, the right physical multiplier, the right DNA, mix it together. And then I think you're really ready to take on big problems, right? And in order to put it together, this comes from my own experience. So a few years ago, I was on a program called Joint Strike Fighter, okay? It is, again, if you're not familiar, it's the largest procurement and something very challenging, a single plane which meets the needs of Navy, Air Force, Army, and the Marines for 11 countries. You put it together, right? And it was basically, it's almost, even after when it started in late 90s, early 2000, you had 60 years of solid aviation history behind it. But they said, how do we do a new plane? We do it in 5 years, a tenth of the cost, and change every subsystem. So a chance to see how large companies, two different teams which started off, Boeing and Lockheed, with hundreds of suppliers, built up this ecosystem and actually created the plane, and it's now in active services, right? And it's just, so finally, the point is, I think what is key is all this doesn't happen by itself, right? So the takeaway from my own journey was, it starts with the advisor. You do not get dropped into an ecosystem. So the right internships at the right place, in the right settings, if that's what you really want, with the right mentoring, the right faculty, putting it all together is what gets the process started for alumni, like who are now graduating as I was, 30 years ago. So that's my perspective. It's a
Great. Thank you, Sandeep. So from your inputs, we figure out that interdisciplinary working is the way forward, and plus the internships also. If you have one industry mentor and one academic mentor, then I think that is the way forward. And this is one of the things which we have been able to do successfully in Sarthi program. Specifically in chemical engineering department, where we have had some industry academia interaction. And now we move to Sid. Would request him to share his experiences, how the life sciences companies have responded to the latest challenge, and how the IP comes into play in terms of industry academia interaction. Because I have faced a little bit of a challenge in limited interaction in our Sathi program, where the department as well as the industry, we are trying to work out on some joint R&D projects, and IP is one of the issues which is generally top of the line discussion points. Yes, Sid.
Right. So in terms of this, just going back to your original question about the future of R&D, and then I'll bring in some of my experiences, and particularly around the IP side of things. So I couldn't agree more with what Sandeep just very, very brilliantly articulated about the various sort of touch points that all come together or need to come together in order to sort of make research or R&D successful. And I sort of just step back and take a couple of, or put forward a couple of take-home messages from what he said and what I've been seeing. And particularly in context of COVID-19 as well, we can see that there are essentially two real elements that we're seeing today. And this is really the baseline for what and how research is going to be built on, and R&D is going to be built on in the future, which is to do with collaborations, partnerships. On the one hand, you cannot survive on your own anymore. To be fair, you have never really survived on your own. This has always been true, that partnerships, collaborations have been at the heart of some of the big breakthroughs in life science technologies and indeed other technologies over the decades. But particularly so now, and I'll give the example of how COVID research was able to turn around so quickly and so fast. This doesn't happen just because it was COVID. It didn't happen because it was a pandemic of humongous proportions and significant impact. It happened because over the years, over the decades, there has been this building up of a certain mindset and certain approach to work and collaborations that have enabled this pivot to what one was doing pre-COVID, to deploying those resources, the talent, that knowledge base to addressing for a very, very particular application. In other words, COVID research, COVID applications, vaccine development in a very, very quick period of time. There is this public-private partnership, which some of you, probably all of you have heard of. It's called GISAID, which is essentially the global initiative on all influenza, on sharing of all influenza data. This was set up about 10 years ago, around the time when the bird flu came about, and then SARS. And it's essentially it is a repository for influenza and DNA data around the influenza virus. And that's where the Chinese, as you know, published their sequence for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And that's the point from where it all took off. Everyone had access to it. Everyone took that information, and then they developed elements of that entire product value chain, going from fundamentally understanding what makes the virus tick, how it works, the S1 domain, the receptor binding domain on the S1, the spike protein that we've all heard of so much in the media, into now a vaccine that is 90–95% effective. So this has happened because there was a framework for partnerships and collaboration that enabled data to be shared very easily and very effectively across the board. The second point in my future of research, and I'll come to the IP point in a minute, is about data. It is about using the smart use of data, because there is so much of it everywhere. And you can't, as individuals, we see it all the time in our own research at Fluidic Analytics, there is a phenomenal amount of information out there, and being able to sort of weed out the good from the noise is a massive challenge. And then going back to a point that again Sandeep touched on, artificial intelligence, machine learning, much of those algorithms, much of that approach to actually process information to at least filter it down to more usable and manageable levels is where I think is another strand in sort of the future and the future of work. And all of this is going to be enabled by digital technologies, cloud technologies, and we've seen so much of it happening across the board. Indeed, we ourselves and many companies, technology startups in the Cambridge area, they focus on, or they start as a core part of their business strategy is about how they future-proof the data usage and the data technologies. So it's not just about what you're generating today and what technologies you're developing here and now, but how do you ensure that that technology is scalable from a data perspective going forward 10 years and going forward 20 years, for as long as your technology is relevant. And technology changes so quickly, so what you have today may be completely redundant in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years time. The IP is an interesting one. IP has traditionally been considered almost as a hindrance to innovation, a hindrance to collaboration partnerships, because it seemed like it was a barrier that I have my intellectual property and you cannot, you don't, and that it wasn't the most positive, and it wasn't the most, or seen as the most productive way of doing collaborative work. But that mindset has changed, and has changed dramatically globally, because you see now intellectual property as giving you legal ownership and some kind of a legal protection of your knowledge and your information. And actually, I would argue that it enables that freer flow of information and knowledge between partners, between collaborators, between groups, to then enable that the elements of a research or an R&D ecosystem to come together and work more effectively. The classic whole being the greater than the sum of the parts is what you can enable when you have a robust intellectual property portfolio that protects your knowledge, your ability to, legally protects what you know, what you have, and enables you to more openly share that with the wider, in the wider ecosystem. And we have actually seen a lot of changes over the last, say, decade, 10, 20 years, where the traditional IP and in context of IP, it's really patents in this field. But the traditional patent applicants, the patent owners, were Western Europe, USA was very big, UK, Europe as well. But that has changed towards some of the smaller relatively smaller economies in Asia, Taiwan, South Korea. China is now a small economy, but China has been extremely extremely aggressive with its patenting and its IP technology. India is also very, very strong in that, but has a long way to go if you look at some of the figures. And the reason is because knowledge is where those economies are, is what drives those economies. Many of Taiwan, for example, if you look at their people resources, the natural resources, their internal market's relatively small. So they have to play in a global market, and that's what they're doing. Similarly with South Korea. And in order to play, in order to be part of that global economy, how do they then go out, take their innovations, their technologies out there and be able to protect what they do and yet be a major player in those markets? And that's where intellectual property and intellectual property protection comes in. We have a very similar approach as well, we being Fluidic Analytics. So just very briefly, we're a Cambridge University spin-out. We have a microfluidic technology, but looking broadly at protein interactions. So one of the core application areas we've pivoted towards is, again, COVID-19, in partnership with clinical researchers, in partnership with industry and some of the vaccine and drug manufacturers as well, looking or taking our technologies and enabling researchers to understand how antigens interact, the affinity of those bindings, which antibodies are more effective, and so on, and looking across our ability to actually deploy our technology to these completely new applications, which we hadn't even considered.
Or I'll have to cut you short. Just
yeah, sorry. Okay, yeah. So I'll just quickly wrap up. So
yeah.
So intellectual property, I think, is an IP, and IP protection is actually is very important, is very relevant, because, as I said, it enables the freer flow and freer exchange of ideas, knowledge, information within that ecosystem that all come together to solve a particular problem.
Great. Thank you, Sid. So Pradeep would talk about how do you feel, Pradeep, the digital payments and digital banking is actually contributing to facilitating the ecosystem with respect to the discussions which we have had so far?
So I think, just in the interest of time, Mukesh, I will just touch upon what is really happening.
Because we are running out of time. We have already.
Yeah.
So
let me just make
sure.
2 comments here, and then maybe Anubhav and Ramesh can take it forward. I think in terms of trends, what we are seeing is there are a couple of trends which are impacting the businesses hugely. Mm-hmm. First of all, I think what has happened with the internet explosion and digital age is that the knowledge and expertise, which were earlier differentiators of competitiveness in the marketplace, have really disappeared, because everybody has similar knowledge and expertise is really available off the shelf. So that's a very important thing that businesses need to recognize, that R&D and innovation has become much more important now than in the past. And the other thing that is very important to recognize is that the life cycle of innovation or life cycle of R&D has reduced significantly, right? What was available earlier, and you could create a product and say for next 20 years, I'm going to sell that product and make profit, that is no longer valid. It's now coming to about 6 months' time. The product can be copied or improved by your competitors. And the third one really is that, the life cycle of creating new innovations has really come down significantly, and it has to continue to come down, because R&D was traditionally supposed to be where people will invest for many years, and then if you find something, then it leads to an innovation or a new product. No longer the case, right? And Sandeep mentioned about COVID. Usually a vaccine would take decades to become commercialized. And we have seen COVID vaccines come in more than 6 months' time. Now, this might be an extreme case because we needed, the mankind needed it to happen fast. But it's not an aberration. I think the innovations continue to be faster and the cycle time needs to be reduced, both in terms of the need for it as well as competitiveness and the business case. So I think these are some of the mega trends we are seeing in business. And maybe Ramesh and Anubhav can
Yeah,
throw more
great.
light on what they're doing in this
Sure,
area.
sure. So going by what all you guys have said, vaccine is a good example. Corona is a good example of how R&D ecosystems, global ecosystems have worked together rather than working in silos independent of each other. And they have been able to go the distance in meeting the need of the crisis of the pandemic. So I would request Anubhav and Ramesh to share their experiences because both have been part of global R&D success stories, and Ramesh specifically comes from Mahindra and Mahindra, which is a huge global level success story. So what can say that career mentoring is a huge component when teams have to work at global level. So with this in mind, I would request Anubhav to just talk about this and also talk about how those practices at global level can be replicated with the IIT Delhi through the alumni network, through the departments, through the institute, various departments or various whatever best practices we can do.
Yeah.
So over to Anubhav, and then Ramesh will drive it forward.
Thanks, Mukesh. I think I fully relate with what Pradeep said and Sandeep said before. With respect to the current ecosystem in R&D, which is required, keeping future in mind, is absolutely essential pace of innovation and agility. Right, so those days have gone where the like corporate R&D, which I used to work earlier in GE, right, which will take so much time to do research because of internal focus. But in today's world, even the competitors are collaborating. So I think before I specifically go to your point, Mukesh, just briefly, maybe in the 60 seconds, right? What we have been doing in Pidilite, establishing external partnership. I think that's the key because nothing can be like if you focus more internally, develop platform, etc., do research, then it will take quite a bit of time. And the whole product life cycle, which Pradeep talked about, nobody had that patience. So how can you establish partnership, joint venture, technology licenses quickly? And your organization should be fully, the ecosystem should be fully evolved in terms of people, in terms of connecting those up with the opportunity, taking decisions, etc. Right. And the second element, the whole tools, the digital tools. The good news is this is all good for India. I'm just putting more from the Indian perspective. Earlier, like establishing a full-fledged R&D center, right, is a very costly affair. But in today's scenario, where the lot of information free flowing, right, world is becoming smaller and smaller, globalization. So you can easily connect with whoever you want and strike the discussion, build into the relationship, partnership, and then making sure that your strategy is continuously moving forward, right? And third element, which is just coming to your point as well, which I personally feel the whole culture piece, the employee empowering culture, which is important to build in India. Indian R&D organizations are typically hierarchy in nature, but like if we have a employee empowering culture which promote decision making, risk taking, that will help employee to relate with the purpose what they are doing, and hence it will they will have much more ownership, and eventually the pace of innovation will improve definitely. So when it comes to the mentoring part, which you just mentioned, say I call it right the mentors, which is more like a GPS for your professional career. So again, if you need agility, a speed, it's good to have someone who validate your thoughts, so, right, at the very regular basis. And the three things which I want to highlight here, which the mentor-mentee relationship should have. First and foremost is the respect, right? Mentor will get nothing from the mentee other than respect. Sometime in my professional experience, I have noticed that mentee typically use mentor as a consultant. So there's a difference between the consultant and the mentor. So hence the second point is the commitment. So if you really want to have a good mentor for your life, mentor is like a GPS for your career, then you need to have a lot of commitment from your side and making sure that you are building a relationship, and so that you are getting all help which are required in terms of validation of thought and taking a good decision which are meaningful to your in your company. And the third, which is the most important one, is the trust. So when you are striking a discussion between mentor and mentee, you have to ensure that from both the sides trust are there, so that the free flow of the conversation happens, right? And then you can express your whatever is in your head, and also be more open for others from the mentor point of view, that what the person is saying, and that is the trust is the basic fundamental and the foundation for any mentor-mentee relationship. Respect to the how we can do it more with IITT and Sarthi. In my personal experience, in India, we have a lot of engineers with have a decent technical skills, but there's not necessarily they have an employable soft skills or the right attitude towards a job. And a lot of data published in India, they hardly like the single digit or maybe the lower, like the 10 to 12% sort of a engineers and the scientists passing out from the India, they are employable right away. So they have a limitation in terms of understanding how industry works, what type of soft skills, professional skills one should have it. And based on Harvard and Stanford study, and there are many such independent studies, where like the 85% success in the professional career depends on the attitude and the unique skill. So that's the way I will summarize.
Great. Thank you. Ramesh, would like you to share your M&M success story and how we can take that learnings from that success story in the future of R&D related.
Mukesh, can you help me with how much time I have so that I can tailor it? Being the last has an advantage, it also has a disadvantage. Advantage because a lot of what he wanted to say, the person wanted to say, has probably been addressed. Disadvantage because you have a time crunch. So how much time do you think I have?
We are on time, but I think we can stretch it by about 4-5 minutes.
Okay, great. So let me first and foremost respond by saying that I think the future of R&D, I think this is something which doesn't come very naturally to India, which has historically been, has grown up in a verbal, word of the mouth, guru shishya kind of a parampara, as it were. So I think what we will need to do is do a lot of work on processes and documenting processes. I think I'm talking in the context, in a broader context, but certainly in the area of R&D, enabling and facilitating R&D and R&D outcomes. Certainly, I think if I remember right, Sandeep also touched upon that. That I talked about processes. I'm a big one for processes. I think scale and things will and focus and getting into that big number game will come only when we have that focus on what you call documentation and processes. Now, specifically to some points, I will elaborate more like questions if you are. I think some things have been touched upon already. Speed. I think let me give you a couple of examples of, I think speed clearly, I think what has been mentioned here on the forum is that COVID drove a certain amount of speed of vaccine development, but I think COVID also drove a certain amount of speed in terms of, organizing for work from home, minimum people in the factories or no people in the factories. To give you an example, Siemens has already announced that certain functions and functionalities of the organization will never need to come to office. They will work from home forever. I picked this up from LinkedIn some months ago. So factories, therefore, when you talk of speed, factories will have to gear up. And we are not so well versed, particularly in the production environments in terms of AI, IoT. Although you'll be surprised, in our factories, in the component factories, there's a whole lot of work happening today on AI, IoT, connectivity of machines, so that you can minimize the human intervention there and work therefore more, get more accurate information and get more reliable information and get more productive. Which will also impact downstream or upstream availability of technologies and resources like internet and bandwidth availability in India, and has to probably become less expensive. So therefore, a whole lot of work, I believe, will happen around those areas, to make it more. To give you an example from home in speed and adapting to technology needs or driven by the environment, when I think it was in the 70s when the petrol prices in India went through the roof, and Mahindra Jeeps were all petrol. So it was within a matter of weeks that a tractor engine was adapted, a tractor diesel engine was adapted to be put on a Jeep, which may not have been most efficient at that time. It probably did a dug kind of a sound. But then over time, this has been perfected over time. So I think therefore the Mahindra ability to do that is fairly strong. Similarly, from Mahindra, once the regulation of certain tax breaks for less than 2000 cc engine came into play, Mahindra didn't take much time. Way faster than anybody else. Mahindra, talking of square engines, all that they had to probably do is change stroke, change the crankshaft, and then you were ready. After a few trials and so on, you were ready. So I think speed is going to be very critical. Then there are changing environmental factors, the second key one, which will determine the R&D future. For example, this whole monkey called electric car. To the best of my knowledge, there are about 50 plus, probably 100 companies worth of a ecosystem already on ground in around Pune, which is working in various areas like motor and control, electronics, lightweighting, a little bit about battery as well. So I think some of those areas will need to get a fillip. I think a point which has been talked about very, very extensively, and I would like to, at the cost of repeating what I want to say, is this whole thing about cross-country, cross-geography collaborations, which is very, very key to R&D outcomes going forward. And to give you a Mahindra example, and I think it has to be a combination of these collaborations, have to be a combination of developing capabilities in-house versus collaboration with outside and sometimes with competition. Tata Steel, for example, collaborates with some Japanese steel companies to collaborate and do certain areas, and acquisitions. So therefore, development of in-house resources, collaboration and acquisitions. For example, Mahindra, like any other company, had started as a very conservative R&D, more product engineering kind of a setup of Kandivali. It moved to Chennai, the Mahindra Research Valley. Then it got experts like FEV and AVL on board in terms of collaborations for transmission and engine development. Then it acquired companies like SsangYong and Swaraj, which gave it a platform and a certain capability. And talking of global, it set up a tech center in Detroit, which was an excellent tapping of an opportunity available in Detroit. Because without hurting anybody here or without being disrespectful to anybody here, I think Detroit was a dying city. There was a whole lot of talent sitting there, but it wasn't used. So Mahindra took the lead to set up a tech center there, so that engineers from Kandivali to Chennai to SsangYong to Detroit could actually collaborate and work together. And then a whole lot of collaboration, industry, exchange of people happened. And then, as I said, the last feather in the cap was acquiring a company like Pininfarina. So these are stories of global stuff as well as collaboration, which Mahindra has done very successfully over the years. And some have been, obviously, I think it will be prudent only to say that some have been a little more successful than some of the others. But by and large, the thought has been one of collaboration across geographies, across cultures, and tapping into pools of skills and competencies and experience which are already available in existence. Last but not the least, or maybe two of them, one I have touched upon, the global view already, the Mahindra Tech Center in Detroit. And by the way, in the Mahindra component or Mahindra CIE component businesses also, we have used the same. I used to run a gear company in Italy, for example, along with, I used to have a portfolio where I ran the Italian company as well as the Indian company. So I could tap into the resources in that company and in the neighborhood. And Italy is very, very good when it comes to technologies, which are not so high cost, smaller companies, smaller outfits, boutiques available for tapping into technology. So I could develop a transmission and an axle with help from those technologies, and in the process also developed capabilities of our own in this in our own company. Last but not the least, that I think has been talked about, is actually the organizations taking a serious note of nurturing innovative temperament. And Mahindra follows a very, again, following a process and I'm a student of process all my life, actually run innovation as a process in the company, on an annual kind of a cycle basis, or whatever frequency you have, and getting that embedded into the development psyche of people across. Now, it is not only for R&D people, it's for manufacturing, it's for, everybody. So therefore, Mahindra, for example, practices under certain categories called product innovation, process innovation, business model innovation, as well as failed innovation, which also teaches you a lot. So I think that's a culture we want to promote. We should be promoting, and I think that will see more and more. There are more and more boutiques coming up in India, whether it is Erwan or whether it is XYZ, who are actually engaging with a lot of customers and helping them tap into that innovation game. So that's all I had to say. I think.
Thank you,
That's where I would
Ramesh.
like to stop.
So I would just like to say and sum it up.
Hello, Mr. Bhadra.
Yeah.
As we can see, we have had a very wonderful session, but unfortunately now we are due for the concluding ceremony of this.
Yeah, we are just winding up. Just 2 minutes.
Just quickly wrap it up, because we start at
6:40 it's going to start. I mean, already people are asking us to begin that session.
Yeah. We are just winding up.
So
to
please,
summarize, thank you. To summarize, the way forward is a knowledge sharing platform, process, excellence, and the way forward is, like Sid had mentioned, and I had seen in your profile, which we did not touch upon, you have worked in inter-university programs. So that is also very important. So globally, across countries, across universities, and across industries. And of course, the model which, the Detroit model, if I may use the term, has been very successful in IT industry, and we need to take it to other industries in the nurturing of R&D ecosystems. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks
Okay.
a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mukesh.
Yeah,
Very good
we'll be in
session.
touch regarding the tangible action points for Sati program on these lines. Thank you.
Look
Okay.
forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
It was nice knowing all of you and interacting with you. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm here.
Thank you. We'll be in touch.
legal.